I caught my mother-in-law's eye from across the room, and something in her expression made my stomach drop. Not the usual polite confusion, but something sharper. Recognition. She was standing near the dessert table at my brother's rehearsal dinner, holding a glass of white wine, and she had been watching me for the better part of 10 minutes. I knew because I'd been watching her too, the way you watch a slow-moving storm you're not sure is coming your way. Then she took a step toward me, and I gave the smallest possible shake of my head. She stopped, tilted her head, and said nothing. That was the moment I knew the next 48 hours were going to be very different from what my family had planned. Let me back up, because none of that makes sense without the part I've spent 3 years trying to figure out how to tell. I'm the older one, by 4 years. My brother Dex is 31, I'm 35, and our whole lives the gap between us wasn't just in age, it was in the way my parents saw us, talked about us, introduced us to people. Dex was the one who lit up a room. Dex was the one who got the good stories at the dinner table. Dex was the golden one, not because he was smarter or kinder or worked harder. Honestly, I'm not even sure Dex would argue with me on this, but because he fit the mold my parents had in their heads of what a successful person looked like. He worked in commercial real estate. He drove a nice truck. He played hockey on weekends and knew how to talk to people at parties without making it weird. My parents could explain Dex to anyone in about 20 seconds flat, and those 20 seconds always ended with someone nodding and smiling, like everything made perfect sense. Me? They'd been trying to explain me for 15 years and never quite managed it. I left home at 18 to study and ended up in a field that sounds boring when you say it out loud. Compliance consulting. Specifically, I work with mid-sized companies, mostly in manufacturing and finance, to assess regulatory risk, build internal audit frameworks, and prepare them for federal reviews. I know. I've watched people's eyes glaze over. I've started saying I work in business consulting, at parties just to avoid the follow-up questions. But here's the thing about a boring-sounding job, it pays very, very well when you're good at it. By the time I was 28, I had incorporated my own firm. By 30, I had 4 full-time staff and contracts with 11 clients across 3 provinces. By 33, I was the person other consultants called when their clients were in serious trouble with the CISA or facing an OSF review. I wasn't flashy, I didn't post about it. I drove a sensible Subaru and lived in a condo in downtown Ottawa that my parents had never visited. They knew I did something with paperwork for businesses. That's a direct quote from my mother. She does something with paperwork for businesses, she told people. She always was a very organized girl. I had stopped correcting her years ago. Not out of bitterness, or at least, not entirely out of bitterness, but because I had learned that correcting her required a 20-minute conversation that always ended with her saying something like, "Well, I'm sure it's very important work," in a tone that made it clear she didn't think it was important at all. My father was more direct. "I just don't understand why you didn't do something with a real office," he said once, which was funny, because I had a real office, a very real office on Spark Street, with a glass door and my name on it. But by real office, he meant something like Dex's company, where you could see the building from the highway and the parking lot had a sign. So I stopped talking about work at family events. I showed up, I ate the food, I listened to Dex's stories about deals he'd almost closed, and I drove home. That was the arrangement for years. It worked in the way that arrangements you've made peace with tend to work. Then Dex got engaged. Her name is Sophie. She's a dental hygienist from Barrie who is genuinely one of the warmest people I've ever met. Quick to laugh, straightforward, no nonsense, the kind of woman who remembers your coffee order and your dog's name and asks real follow-up questions. I liked her from the first time Dex brought her home for Easter 2 years ago. I still like her. I want to be very clear about that because Sophie is not the problem in this story. Sophie never was. Sophie's family, though, her family was a different situation. Her mother had been a federal judge for over 2 decades before her retirement. Her father had built a mid-size environmental engineering firm that he'd sold in his early 60s for a number I will not repeat here because I did not confirm it, and I refused to gossip. But it was enough that the family had a place on Lake Muskoka that they referred to simply as the cottage, the way you'd refer to a spare room. Sophie's older sister was a partner at a Bay Street law firm. Her younger brother had done 3 tours as a medic and come home to run a nonprofit in Sudbury that was actually doing good, visible work. They were accomplished people who wore it quietly. That was the thing. Sophie's mother, I'll call her Judge Hartwell, because that's what everyone called her, even her family, even at casual dinners. She didn't announce herself. She just asked questions. She had this way of listening to you that made you feel like she was filing everything away, not in a suspicious way, but in the way of someone who understood that information mattered and paid attention accordingly. I had met her twice before the rehearsal dinner, once at an engagement party in Barrie, once at a family dinner in December. Both times she had been perfectly pleasant and asked me very specific, pointed questions about my work that I'd answered honestly, and she had nodded and moved on without making a thing of it. My mother had watched those exchanges with something I can only describe as low-grade alarm. On the drive home from the December dinner, she said, "I don't know why you have to bring all that up. It just sounds like you're showing off." I had not brought it up. Judge Hartwell had asked me directly about a federal regulatory change that had been in the news. I had answered the question, but I let it go. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant in Barrie my mother had chosen, nice Italian place on Dunlop Street, private room, 40 people, white tablecloths. My parents had offered to pay for it as their contribution to the wedding, which was a genuinely lovely gesture, and I want to give them credit for that. What they did not tell me until I arrived was that they had also apparently briefed every single person at that dinner on my occupation. I figured this out about 12 minutes in when Sophie's aunt, a retired high school principal from Aurelia who I'd never met, patted my arm and said very kindly, "And you keep busy with the cleaning work, do you? Good for you, good steady work." I blinked. "I'm sorry, the housekeeping. Dex mentioned you've built up quite a nice little business." I stood there for a second with a glass of sparkling water in my hand and thought, Dex wouldn't have said that. Dex actually knew what I did, which meant it hadn't been Dex. I excused myself, found a quiet spot near the coat rack, and sent my brother a text. "Did Mom tell people I clean houses for work?" His response came back in under 2 minutes. "Oh God, I just heard. I'm sorry." I didn't know she was going to do that. I put my phone in my pocket and stood there for a moment, breathing very slowly and deliberately, looking at the framed photos of the Italian countryside on the wall. Here is the thing about a moment like that. You have a choice. You can walk back into that room and correct the record, which means explaining yourself to 40 people mid-aperitivo, which is exactly what my mother would call making a scene. Or you can let it go, eat your dinner, hug your brother, wish him well, and deal with the rest of it later. I had made my decision by the time the breadsticks arrived. I would not correct anyone. I would be pleasant and warm, and I would toast my brother's happiness, and I would go home, and I would deal with my mother later privately, the way adults do. What I had not accounted for was Judge Hartwell. She found me during the appetizer course, pulled a chair out across from me with the quiet efficiency of someone who has run courtrooms, and sat down. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For what?" I almost said something very embarrassing when I walked in. "Someone told me you ran a housekeeping service. I nearly asked you if you'd taken on any clients in Ottawa, because we have a property there we've been trying to find good help for." She paused. And then I thought, that doesn't match up, because I remembered our conversation at dinner in December, and I remembered what you actually do. So I went and asked Sophie instead. I looked at her for a moment. "And what did Sophie say?" "She said you're one of the most senior compliance consultants in Ontario, and that the last client you helped avoided what would have been a 7-figure penalty in a CRA audit." She set her wine glass down. She also said, and I'm quoting, "My mother-in-law to be told everyone at the party she cleans houses, and I have no idea why." The table nearest us had gone very quiet. I said, "I think my mother finds it easier to explain that way." Judge Hartwell looked at me with the expression of a woman who has spent 25 years watching people say things in courtrooms that they will shortly regret. "Does she?" It wasn't a question. I didn't answer it. What happened next I did not engineer and did not ask for. But I also, if I'm being honest with myself, did not stop. Judge Hartwell excused herself, found my mother near the bread station, and had what appeared, from across the room, to be a very calm, very brief, very pointed conversation. I watched my mother's expression cycle through 3 distinct phases: polite confusion, dawning understanding, and a color I can only describe as the precise beige of someone who has just realized they have made a significant miscalculation. My father, who had been standing next to her, looked at his shoes. I turned back to my dinner. Dex found me 10 minutes later and sat down in the chair Judge Hartwell had vacated. He had a plate of bruschetta and the look of someone who was working very hard to keep his face neutral. "So," he said, "so, Mom is currently having what she's describing as a headache. I hope she feels better. He put a piece of bruschetta in his mouth and chewed for a moment. She's going to want to talk to you about this. I know, and you're going to be very reasonable and calm about it. I'm going to try. He looked at me sideways. Did you know Judge Hartwell was going to do that? I picked up my fork. She asked me not to say anything. I didn't say anything. Dex was quiet for a moment then. That tracks. We ate in silence for a bit. The room had resettled into the low hum of 40 people eating pasta and pretending not to be watching the table in the corner where my mother was sitting very rigidly next to my father, staring at her gnocchi. Sophie came and found me just before dessert. She hugged me first, which I didn't expect, and then sat down and said, "I'm so sorry, I should have caught this earlier." I knew something felt off at the table when Aunt Renee said, "It's fine," I said. "Really, it's not fine." She said it gently but firmly, the way she said most things. "It's not fine, and I want you to know that I know it's not fine." I looked at her for a second, this woman who was about to marry my brother, who had gone out of her way to quietly correct the record with her own mother, who was now sitting here making sure I knew she was paying attention, and I thought, Dex did okay. Dex did really, really okay. "Thank you," I said. Genuinely. "My mom really likes you, by the way. She asked if you'd be willing to have coffee while you're in town this weekend. She wants to talk to you about something work adjacent." I raised an eyebrow. Sophie smiled. "I know, she's intense, but she means it well." The rest of the dinner passed without incident. My mother's headache lasted through dessert and into the parking lot. When we said goodbye, she hugged me the way she always did. Quick pat on the back, already pulling away, and said, "Drive safe," in the voice of a woman who was saving the real conversation for later. My father squeezed my shoulder and said nothing. My father was very good at saying nothing. It was something we had in common. I drove back to my hotel, changed into pajamas, made a cup of tea with the terrible little kettle on the dresser, and sat on the edge of the bed for a while. I thought about calling my best friend Ren, who had been texting me all evening asking for updates. I thought about going over everything that had happened and trying to figure out how I felt about it. I thought about the look on my mother's face when Judge Hartwell spoke to her. Instead, I just sat there. The kettle ticked as it cooled. The parking lot outside was quiet. I felt, more than anything else, tired. Not the bad kind, not the kind that grinds you down, but the kind that comes after you've been holding something tense for a very long time and you've finally been able to let go of it, even just for a moment. The next morning was the wedding. I wore a green dress I'd bought in Toronto a month earlier, silver earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, and the low heels I'd worn to 17 client meetings that year. I looked like myself. I felt like myself. Dex was nervous in the way he always got nervous. Too much movement, too many jokes, kept checking his tie. I fixed his tie in the vestibule of the church and told him he was going to be fine, and he grabbed both my hands and said very quietly, "Thank you for last night, for being the way you were." I said, "I didn't do anything." He said, "I know, that's what I mean." The ceremony was at a small church in Barrie that Sophie's family had attended for years. It was simple and warm, and Sophie cried at the vows in the way where you can tell she'd hoped not to but wasn't actually surprised that she did. Dex didn't cry until Sophie's little nephew, maybe 6 years old, completely unplanned, walked up the aisle holding the rings on a pillow with the concentration of someone diffusing a device. And then Dex absolutely lost it, and the whole church laughed, and Sophie laughed, and I sat in the second row behind my parents and felt something that took me a moment to name: joy. Straightforward and uncomplicated. Joy. The reception was at a golf club on the edge of town. Tables by the window, late afternoon light, a DJ who had strong opinions about classic rock. My mother had been seated at the family table, and I had been placed by Sophie's very deliberate arrangement directly across from Judge Hartwell. I noticed this. I said nothing about it. I just sat down and unfolded my napkin. Judge Hartwell was already at the table. She smiled when I sat down. "Sleep well?" Reasonably, I said. "You?" "I never sleep well away from home." "Too quiet." She picked up her water glass. "I'd like to ask you something, if that's all right." "Of course. We have a business. I'm sure Sophie mentioned my husband's firm sold several years ago, but he retained a small division as a separate entity. It's grown more complicated than anticipated, and we had an audit flag come up last quarter. Our current accountant is excellent but not really equipped for this particular situation." She paused. "I'd like to know if you'd be available to consult, or if you could recommend someone you trust." I thought about it for a moment. "What province is the entity registered in?" "Ontario." Though we have some cross-border contract work that's added a layer, that's manageable. I'd need to see the flag notice and the past 2 years of filings before I could give you a real sense of scope. She nodded. I'll have my assistant send them Monday. Send them to my firm address. I'll have my intake coordinator reach out to set up a call. She smiled. Good. My mother, who had been listening from the other side of the table with the stillness of someone who had stopped pretending not to listen, put down her fork. She didn't say anything. She just put down her fork. My father looked at the breadbasket. I took a sip of my water. The speeches started an hour later. Dex's best friend gave one that was funny and slightly too long and ended with a genuinely lovely thing about loyalty. Sophie's sister spoke about the specific quality of her sister's love, the way it was practical and concrete, not abstract and performative. How she showed up with groceries and stayed to put them away. How she remembered what you said 3 Christmases ago and acted on it quietly. I thought about that description and felt it land somewhere. Then it was my turn. I had written 3 different versions. Scrapped all of them at 2 in the morning in my hotel room. Was currently standing at the front of the room with nothing in my hands and approximately 200 eyes on me, which was fine, because I had given presentations to rooms full of hostile regulators, and this was objectively less bad than that. I said, I've been trying to figure out what to say for about 6 weeks now, and I think the reason I kept getting it wrong is that I was trying to explain what Dex means to me, and I'm not sure that's actually the right thing to talk about. I paused. What I want to say is this. I have watched my brother be loved by a lot of people over the years, in a lot of ways, and most of that love was easy for him. He's easy to love. It wasn't hard for people to figure out how to do it. But the way Sophie loves him is different. It's not easy love. It's paying attention love. It's the kind that notices when something's wrong before you've said it, and the kind that sticks around for the hard version of a person, not just the good party version. I looked at Sophie. She was already crying again. Dex was gripping her hand. I didn't know that kind of love was available for him, I said. I'm really glad I was wrong. I raised my glass. The room raised theirs. I sat back down. Judge Hartwell touched my arm briefly and said nothing, which was, from her, more than enough. My mother caught up with me by the coat check at the end of the night. She had her wrap around her shoulders and her good purse in both hands, the way she held it when she was working up to something. I'd known that purse grip for 35 years. I let her work up to it. I didn't realize, she said finally, that Sophie's mother knew so much about what you do. She asked me questions, I said. I answered them. I just thought it was easier to. She stopped, tried again. People don't always understand what you do. I was just trying to. Mum, I said it quietly, not unkindly. I know. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a second I saw the version of her that existed before she became my mother. Just a person slightly bewildered, trying to make sense of something she hadn't expected. I'm proud of you, she said, like it cost her something. I don't know if she meant it the way I needed her to mean it. I don't know if it was the start of something different or just a moment that would close over again by Tuesday. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that I hugged her, and she hugged me back, a real one this time, not the pat and pull, and then she and my father walked out to their car, and I stood there in the foyer for a moment while the DJ played something by Tom Petty in the room behind me. Ren called on the drive back to Ottawa on Sunday. I put her on speaker and drove through the flat stretch of the 400, with the windows cracked, and told her the whole thing, start to finish, and she was quiet for most of it, which was the specific quality of listening I loved about her. When I finished, she said, "And how do you feel?" I thought about it. The highway opened up ahead of me, 2 lanes, farmland on both sides, early spring fields the color gray at the edges. Like something shifted, I said. Not fixed, just shifted. Ren made a sound that meant she understood. Also, I said, Judge Hartwell is sending me the audit files Monday, and I think it's going to be a complicated engagement but probably a good one. Ren laughed. A real laugh, the kind that meant I was going to be okay. I kept driving north. The city was still 3 hours away, and I had a full week of calls starting Monday, and a brother who was, at that moment, probably on a plane to Newfoundland for his honeymoon, holding the hand of a woman who loved him the paying attention way. I turned on the radio, found something quiet, and let the road go.